Bartolo, can you hear me?
How are you, Wayne?
Good. I'm good. And how about you?
Good. Sorry about the mix-up on the days.
Well, that was my fault. I put it in two different places. I think we had been trying so hard to schedule something over the months that the minute I thought I had an idea for a time, I probably put it in as tentative and forgot to write tentative next to it.
No worries.
So, how are things over at Mowgli today?
Well, we're getting ramped up for sure. We were supposed to pour the slab today, but I think there was a little bit of rain in the hope to be foundation. So I left campus early this morning, and I wasn't sure if they're still doing that or not.
Ah,
But as soon as the slab is cured, hopefully over the weekend, they'll start erecting the timber frame.
wow.
Yeah, so it's been a long road, but we're almost at the finish line.
Right.
And
And now it begins to gather steam and
well, now you really see the visual effect of the construction. I mean, the site work is incredible. It's drastically different than when you were there for the when we did the shovel ceremony. They did quite a bit of rock work around the back of the foundation, so there's two retaining walls that look fantastic. There's a really nice turning sort of parking area. Um, and then they took down quite a few trees, but we still maintained a lot of the stuff that's, that you can see from the waterfront. So it's exciting. The sailboats have arrived, all six of them, and so then we have a new fleet, and Tommy's finishing up on a couple ramps and they're actually floating docks to put a couple of the sailboats on to make it easier to access for the boys to be able to rig and learn while sitting in the boat on a dock, which is kind of a neat thing. So it's all moving ahead at pace. The standby generator was installed and is completely plumbed in and working. That's right out in front of the jungle house, and we wrapped it in a small brown picket fence. So that's going to be tremendous for the safety and um, continued operations during the summer if we lose power. We had a brand new oven installed in the kitchen, so Dee and Hardy are pretty excited about that, and we're actually buying a couple new big uh, freezers for down in the basement to replace some ones that are starting to show their age a little bit. So some real nice improvements to the kitchen. Chill the Kite is completely finished now. That's that staff housing building that we built from the Jamaica Cottage kit last year. And then the headquarters sort of upgrades were all completed. We got a new roof on headquarters, and they had to do some work to the walls that were rotten. So that's going to last another couple hundred years, we hope, right?
Well, let
So a
me,
lot of a lot of capital improvements, a lot of projects that have been long overdue and have finally come to fruition, and it's all been made possible by the generosity of our alums and families and friends.
let me inject a little bit of formality by introducing you and saying that I'm speaking with my old friend Bartolo Governanti, who I knew as a kid as Bart. And I think it was probably because they wouldn't be able to get us to pay attention long enough to say Bartolo.
Yeah, it went from Bart to Bartolo as an adult, and then now I don't know if I've evolved or devolved into Coach G,
Yeah, right.
and now our head coach Mike with the lacrosse program at Plymouth, right? I work part time. His son Miles is 3 going on 4, and he just started calling me just straight G about a year ago. So now everyone calls me just G.
Uh-huh.
So
That makes it a lot easier.
yeah, everyone's just what's up, G? So it's evolved constantly.
Well, you are sort of the newest. I won't say you're not new because you've been there for years at this point, but tell us a little bit about your specific role as it's defined at Mowgli, and then talk about how you actually first came to Mowgli.
Sure. So I'll probably start with that, and then finish with the roles just to
Okay.
flip it a little bit. Probably makes more sense. My father was the founding director of Camp Mayhew, which is an all boys program down on Mayhew Island at the southern end of the lake. He was hired basically out of the Tilton School, where he was a teacher and coach. He started the lacrosse program at the Tilton School in the mid to late '60s. So I grew up down at Tilton, and in 1969, when I was born, 70, a wonderful man, Owen Lindsay, who was an administrator at Tilton, and John Gimmel, who was the director of Pesquani, very good friends of my father. John was also a teacher at Tilton at the time, and then worked as the director at Pesquani in the summers. They formed the Mayhew Trust, a nonprofit under the sort of the umbrella of Mowgli and Pasquani, using their accreditation to form a program for underprivileged boys ages 10 to 13 in the state of New Hampshire. And my dad created that program and ran it for about 15 years. So when I turned 7, they shipped my butt up to the other end of the lake, and I became a Cub in 1976. And I was at Mowgli for 5 years through 1980, so through Aquila. And then I transitioned over to Camp Pasquani because of our relationship with John Gimmel and my desire to be a little bit more advanced sailor and rower. The Pasquani programs are a little bit more advanced just because the boys are older. Pasquani is age 12 to 17, and Mowgli 7 to 14. So there's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities.
Mhm.
And then I transitioned to working for my dad at Mayhew as a junior staff man. We used to call it the clerk of the works, the cow. So I just ran errands all over the place. So many years later, I got reconnected with both Pasquani and Mowgli through the work weekends. Both Mowgli and Pasquani have a work weekend about a week apart in June. And my intention at the time, not only just to reconnect, but also to perhaps join one or both of the board of directors to support those programs. And over the few years that I've been doing the work weekends, I guess about the same time Nick came in, it kind of evolved into an annual ritual that I really enjoyed. I reconnected with a lot of folks that I hadn't seen in sometimes 40 plus years, and really rekindled my love of the camp and the experiences and how it shaped me as a young man and an adult. And so Nick and I had entered some discussions about maybe joining the staff to help Tommy with the maintenance department during the summers. So my first season, a couple seasons ago, I was the summer head of maintenance helping Tommy Greenwell. And then that evolved into a full-time position year round when James Hart left to pursue other opportunities. So they created a two-headed monster in myself and Jay Galitti, Jay being the director of development. So a lot of technical behind the scenes stuff, a lot of paperwork for a lot of the bequests we get, the stock gifts, the donor advised funds. Jay's fantastic on the computer. And then my role developed as the director of alumni relations. So more of the shaking hands and kissing babies and running our special events during the summer, both worked weekends, fall and spring, and then crew day, which continues to grow and evolve and get bigger and bigger every year. So that's really been my main focus. I'm not going to be doing as much with the maintenance this summer and doing more of just sort of assisting Nick around campus as a senior member of the administration. And I'm looking forward to that opportunity to work more directly with kids in some industries and sort of try to take some of the pressure off our senior staff when somebody needs a break or an industry needs to be covered. So sort of a jack of all trades this summer, and then obviously continue to reach out to our alums. It's very difficult during the summer for Nick to spend an appropriate amount of time with visiting alumni, families, or prospective campers. So he's very good at that, but it's hard to pull him away from his computer when he's trying to keep the camp afloat. And so I'm going to hopefully step in and help him with that role a little bit. He's a great closer. Families love him. He's got an incredible memory for people's names and faces. So I think I'm going to be more of a Julie McCoy tour guide, and then let him close the deal.
Mhm.
But the fundraising has become such a critical part of our success, sustainability, and future that James did an incredible job over a 10-year span, basically creating our fundraising program from scratch. And he did an amazing job with that. But he self-admittedly said that a lot of times he just lacked either the time or the energy to sort of hit all the things that need to be hit. So the board made a commitment to have both Jay and I come on in a full-time capacity year round. And I think it's paid dividends in the sense that we've been able to maintain or grow our annual fund. Our endowment continues to grow. And then we just finished an amazing capital campaign where we raised over $600,000 for the waterfront improvement project and the new Hope to Be. So there was some concerns and apprehensions that when you lose a guy like James, that there might be a fall off, but he put us in a tremendous position. We've gotten tremendous support from Nick, from the board, from our year-round staff, and then just generally from the alums that have welcomed us with open arms. And I think we've been able to initiate some real neat projects that are going to help sustain Mowgli through the future. One of my goals is to grow the Bagheera Society, which is our planned giving program that was started in 1983. Jim Graff was instrumental in that, and quite a few others. But basically, the Bagheera is if you want to give us something, a little bit or a lot, or a part of your estate or all of your estate, if you want to give us stocks, if you want to give us insurance policies, these all go to help ensure that Mowgli is stable and can accomplish the things we want to accomplish for many, many years to come. So we've exceeded the century mark. We have 105 members, myself included. I think you're are one of our newest members of the Bagheera. So we're continuing to grow that program. My goal for this year is to hit 125, which in comparison to a program like Pasquani, which is a very stable, long-running camp, they have about 83 members in their similar society. They call it the 1895 Society. So we're actually have more participants than Pasquani, which I was really happy to hear because they have a very passionate alumni base as well. And then really the biggest thing, and I think my most important role, is just thanking people. So I crank out a lot of handwritten notes and personalized notes to people throughout the days and weeks. And we're trying to be very present in the fact that when somebody gives us $1 or $100,000, they're getting the same treatment, and that we show our appreciation. We show it in a timely fashion, that we're processing those funds and getting them to the appropriate accounts, and that we can continue to try to keep our tuition costs down. The actual cost of bringing a camper to Mowgli is probably closer to 16,000 than 10,600. So basically every camper is on some sort of scholarship because the cost of tuition is being subsidized by our endowment, our annual fund, and our scholarship program. So having these outreach, having these the benefits of people giving us those funds allows us to try to make it as affordable to as many families as possible. This year, one of the biggest challenges has been the fact that a lot of families have more need than ever before. Coming out of COVID, where we had some peak years, there's a natural sort of tail off in enrollment in camps. We're experiencing a little bit of an enrollment drop. Part of it is just demographics. Part of it is we had a number of returning students or campers that chose to do family type projects or travel. Nothing that we did wrong. Those campers will probably return at some point, but that's just how things evolve. It's a big commitment going away for 7 weeks for families, and we have to be responsive to that. But we actually had a large bequest last year, and we're drawing some extra funds from some of those bequests to provide some additional scholarship funds for campers this year. But I think we're heading in the right direction. Jay's done a tremendous job in reaching out to some of our more consistent donors and some of our larger donors, and really developing those interpersonal relationships. My goal is to try to reach out and develop a relationship with everybody that I can touch, as far as our current families and parents and campers, our young alumni. We really need to replace folks as they sort of age out and go on to other things. I think we're doing a good job heading in those right directions. It and the board have been tremendously supportive. I know that there was some obvious apprehension when you go from a person of James's strength and abilities and hard work to a new model, and everybody's adapted, I think, very well. I think the last component is just the fact that I get to have fun with all these incredible people. I'll tell you a really quick story. We had a gentleman who was in his 90s. He's 93 years old. Reach out, a former camper, and he has donated in the past, but in response to one or some of our letters and outreach, he said we somehow ferreted him out, and he had some really neat questions about Colonel Elwell and when he was here, which Bob Bankston answered. He wanted to know how many alums were still kicking in their 90s, and we shared some names, and I sent him an architectural history of Mowgli, which is a book that we created a few years ago as a small token. We recently received a sizable check from him to support Mowgli. So that's sort of one of those success stories where somebody who's been connected but not necessarily consistently still has thoughts about his experience. Almost, I think he was at camp right after World War II. So it's been a while since he's been around, and we love to have those kind of folks come out. And those kind of stories happen pretty consistently, which is kind of neat.
Well, you've offered a lot to chew on just in the minutes. I mean, the more than 100 of these podcasts behind us. One of the things that you and I have talked about on several occasions is doing more outreach through the Mowgli Memories podcast to those younger alums.
Sure.
And so, we're going to meet next week or in a couple of weeks.
Sure.
With Nick and Jay to talk about that. I hope more,
right,
among other things. But one of the things that you talked about is something that I think it's worth addressing a bit, and because a lot of people, even people who are close to their Mowgli years in terms of their experience, won't really have thought about it. And that is the tremendous job it is administratively to run a camp that has both an internal focus and an external focus, where where the camp program is going all the time. But most of the time you also have the mountains filled with boys and women who represent Mowgli. And when you take 2 or 3 or 4 staff members from the Mowgli staff and put them out in the White Mountains for 3 or 4 or 5 days, you've got to be sure that that what they're doing at Mowgli in terms of teaching kids doesn't go fallow.
Sure.
because of that. And I assume that a lot of that is, I mean, I know that when I was trip master, we always had to be figuring that out very closely with Mr. Hart. So I imagine that that's exactly what transpires today. But
Yeah, I think the big thing is one of the most important roles on campus during the summer is our schedule. Mr. Wynn, Anthony, Mr. Anthony. It's a thankless job. There's a lot of moving parts. He has some technology helping him, but that's the balancing act because we do give our staff members a day off and a night off every week. That's on a rotational basis. So,
it's amazing.
yeah, I mean, back in the day, you would go to camp for it used to be 8 weeks, and the staff was there for 10, and they never left camp. I mean, rarely, right?
Rarely. I think,
So,
there were summers where I had no days off,
right,
but,
exactly.
if you were really lucky, you might get one day off every 2 or 3 weeks.
Like I remember my dad used to, one of my roles as the clerk of the works at Mayhew was we had a little tiny one bed cabin in the middle of the other six cabins where the boys stayed. And in the evenings, my job was to be in we called it the pillbox and sort of be a roving security guy or just observing. And all the staff would go down to our gymnasium and our lodge and play basketball and have some food and just decompress because it was a 24-hour a day intense kind of a program. And I think, Mowgli, Pasquani, all these camps are very similar. But I think the modern recognition is you need people that are rested, that have some time to get away, especially because it's such an immersive program. So certainly myself, Jay, Nick, Tommy, the sort of year-round staff, Mr. Cosgrove and Mr. Drennan, our senior staff, they're all folks that can be substitutes and can step in when somebody has a day off, or occasionally we have a staff member who's injured or ill. Uh, and the programs have to continue. Typically, we have more than one or two staff trained in each industry.
Mhm.
But, for instance, Miss Ava, the arts and crafts counselor, she's sort of invaluable because she knows more about arts and crafts than I ever will. But there are occasions when somebody needs to step in and cover a period, and the show must go on. So I think it's good sometimes to have some diversity and some different viewpoints coming. One of the things I'm hoping to help Nick and Jay do is a lot of times they sort of get trapped in headquarters, just putting out fires and answering questions of parents and being directors. I'd love for them to be able to take an industry period and just go be with some, a dozen boys at the rifle range or at the waterfront. Nick does a great job with our ropes course. And I know he thoroughly enjoys that, but it's hard for him to pull away from his director responsibilities at times.
Right.
But the real, you touched on the outreach to the younger alumni. We've tried to initiate some things. This year it was one of our, we have a fundraising committee with Jen Devine, Nandi, and Kit. They all have fundraising experience. That's what they do for a career. And one of their ideas that we instituted last year during Crew Week was a paddle raise, which was amazing. Sort of a fun way to get people to donate. They don't actually get anything in return except some satisfaction and a group enjoyment of being a part of something that was pretty exciting. But we raised, I think it was $58,000 in about 10 minutes through the generosity of all the parents and alums that were down in Blue Cove during Crew Weekend. And that was those women's idea. That was one of their ideas that they proposed and we instituted, and they helped carry it out. And we're going to continue that moving forward. Those funds were targeted for Hope to Be, but now that we've reached that goal, we're probably going to target either scholarships or something else this summer. We still do the silent auction, which helps pay for the cost of the crew day and a little extra, and that's grown every year. I know this past year we had ski tickets to Tenny Mountain. We had some restaurant gift certificates. We had 4 tickets to the Patriots game. And then some Mowgli memorabilia. One of the most popular auction items is an oar. So we rotate 1 or 2 oars out of the inventory that have seen some wear, and people go crazy for them. Bob always makes a campfire bench or a Gray Brothers bench that we put in the auction, and those get snapped up. This year we had two prints from Wampanoag from Dick West. And it was really special for me. I know you were a part of this because you went to camp with his son, I believe,
Yes.
or were a compatriot of his. To meet his son in person was a real benefit to me and a real pleasure, and his lovely wife. And just to see him walk around campus, he hadn't been on camp in a number of years, and
50
the memories.
years.
Huh? How many?
It was 50 years when,
Yeah, and I had a similar experience when we had our den of 82, which I actually didn't reach den, but those guys have included me, even though they call me the traitor who went to Pasquani, jokingly. But Bruce Ferguson, Joe Bubalis, Kiffy Wicks, Berkeley, just a great group. Arthur Scocco. We reconnected, and we hadn't seen each other in some cases in 40 years,
yeah,
and I was shocked by that. It just life happens, and you get caught up in things, and we're all busy, and but those reconnections are amazing, and I speak to those guys almost on a daily basis now, if not weekly. And I know Arthur and Joe are going to be up for this work weekend. And that's, I think, really important to get those younger classes conditioned to coming back earlier. So one of the endeavors we've taken on is, instead of just having 50-year reunions, we showcase the class of 50, which in this year is 1975. And we've already got a couple guys committed to come back. But then we've invited every 10-year reunion. So any year that ends in 5 this season has been invited and received several personal invitations to come back to the pack. And that's going to continue to grow and expand. And I know one of the classes that James really targeted, because he was their lead dorm counselor, was the Den of 2015. So a number of those guys are coming back. James actually put up a matching gift sort of internally with that class. So we try to get those guys to crank out their wallets a little bit. But I think what we found is, when people do come back, whether it's just a regular visit, crew weekend, work weekends, they're amazed at how much fun they have, number one, how important the place is to them. And in a lot of cases, people just hand me a check, which is really neat. And it sort of cuts the middleman out. We're not involved in the post office. We're getting those funds directly. But I think it really speaks to the impact of the camp has had on so many young men and women over the years. Another really neat sort of thing that's come up recently is we've got a number of moms that have joined the Bagheera Society. And a couple of them have expressed to me that, I could never be a camper, but what you've done to my young man, or several young men, has been transformative. And, I'm not in a position to give a large sum now, but in the future, you are going to be part of my estate planning. So that's a way for somebody who wasn't able to come to an all boys camp to contribute back. And
sure.
I think that impact is incredible. So those are some of the endeavors we've taken on. The other thing that we've sort of resurrected is the Wantola Society, which was something that was, I think, quite a few years ago, pretty popular, where basically you try to educate the Denites and now our yearlings as to the importance of legacy, what the Bagheera Society is, what giving is. And even if they start with $5, it's establishing those habits of, when that piece of mail comes asking for a gift in the spring and fall, that, hey, Mowgli was important to me, and I'm going to help give back, even though I don't have a lot now. But as they progress through their careers, I think it builds really good habits. And so this year I'll be taking all the Denites and the yearlings one evening. We'll probably go over to the chapel, have a little fake ceremony, give them some pizza, and talk about these important things that are foundational to the success of Mowgli's future.
Yeah. That I'm very pleased to hear about that, because I've talked in the past with Nick about that very thing.
I have a story I'd love to share with you about Mike Hanrahan is the director of Pasquani, very good friend of mine, and his son Ned was a camper for a couple years at Mowgli because he was too young to go to Pasquani, right? Obviously, the 12 is so he was really close with Drew, Nick's son, and when Ned was 11, turning 12, Mike and his wife had a decision, to do we let Ned stay at Mowgli, which he absolutely loved, or do we bring him into the program that we're running? And it's a program that he'll be in for more years, right? Because he can do it until he's 17. So Ned was torn, and I got to know Ned through the work weekends at both camps. And when I told a story to a bunch of the Pasquani folks about my experiences and being at both camps, Ned, I remember, come up to me and sort of very emotionally was like, Coach G, which is the better camp? And I'm like, Ned, they're both great. You're going to love them both. And I think that helped sort of ease his mind a little bit. And this year I was a guest over at Pasquani for a lunch. And the first guy I ran into was Ned. And he ran right up to me. He's like, Coach G, who won the crew race? And I was like, Ned, unfortunately, the red crew won because I'm a blue crew and Ned's blue crew. And he had tears in his eyes. He was still so emotionally invested in that. And I had to give him a hug. And I'm like, dude, it's all right. They put up a valiant fight. But I think, unfortunately, this past year, the rudder on the blue crew boat popped out. So they had about a third of the race with no rudder. And they rallied through it. But the red crew boat was very strong last year. And those experiences are really neat. And Ned, his dad, shared this with me. He's like, he got the Mowgli solicitation letter for I think it was our fall appeal a couple years ago. And he's like, Dad, what is this I'm getting from Mowgli? And he's like, well, Ned, that you can donate money to help Mowgli, stay open. And he's like, all right, I'm gonna take some of my allowance money and I'm gonna. So I got like a $10 check one year, and then another year I think it was like $5 in cash. But Ned is one of our giving back young alums, so we're really excited about that.
Huh. And he went from Mowgli to Pasquani and
Yeah, so he basically had the same track that I had. I think
yeah.
he was here at Mowgli through maybe Baloo. He was a year ahead of Drew. And
Uh-huh.
then so when he was transitioning, he was a first year, I think 2 years ago at Pasquani as a 12-year-old. And he's really a super mature kid. He's not a real big kid. Um, but he's a a wonderful young man, and I'm glad that he's having both experiences.
Sure. And what did you do after Pasquani
So I went there for 2 seasons, and then I went and worked for my dad at Mayhew.
at Mayhew?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier. I was the clerk of the works,
Yeah.
and so one of my roles down there was because we were an island and we were private property. A lot of folks would, on the southern part of the island where there was a lot of just woods and small beaches, they would pull up a canoe or a sailboat and rest, and that was fine. And so every basically half hour, I'd jump in a little 13-foot aluminum with a 6 horsepower Evinrude and cruise around the island and just ask people politely to, move on. And we had posted signs all around the perimeter. And one of my favorite stories was one year I came around the southern tip of Mayhew, and there was about, I don't know, 8 or 9 canoes. I think they were a bunch of guys from Massachusetts probably, and they had been hitting the beers pretty heavy, and they were tossing trash around and just generally being a nuisance. And I sort of drove up, and I was probably 20 feet away and said, gentlemen, I'm sorry, but this is private property. Please, we'd like to ask you politely to move on. And they were none too happy with that and started throwing stuff at me. So I just drove around back to the north end of the island, and I went and grabbed my dad. I was like, Dad, there was a couple guys down at the other end. He sprinted down to a little speedboat we had that had like a 35 horse. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation, because my dad was a big guy and a pretty confident guy, and I'm sure they moved on without much discussion.
Your father, well, like you, I mean, you're a big guy. Your father was a mountain.
Yeah, Big
He was
Tony. Yep.
a man.
And it was funny because in the town we grew up in Alexandria. The local basically constable, this man, Mr. Ramsey, he was the road agent, so he was in charge of the maintaining the roads, but he was also the police officer. There was only one police officer, town about 500 people. And whenever he had problems with a couple of local families that were a little crazy, he'd come down and deputize my dad, and that was his wingman for dealing with some guys that maybe they had to send to prison or something. But John Dunkley, who was the Lake Patrol officer for many years on Newfound,
Yep.
and obviously very involved in all the camps. Similar situation. When John got into a pinch, he would come grab my dad and have a little backup.
Well, I was, as a young staff member, I was pretty involved with the things that Mowgli was doing at Mayhew. In fact, I helped build the first ropes course.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorites as a kid. I used to climb on that almost every day.
Yeah.
And they've made it. I haven't been back to camp since that time, but I know that they've improved it and expanded it quite a bit. The lodge that was built in the 20s by the Groton School, which owned Camp Mayhew, up until about the 50s, they used to run summer programs with their entire student body, all boys, boarding school. And it kind of lay fallow for about 20 years in the 50s and 60s. And that's when the idea came about to, we can't let this resource just sit here idly. Let's purchase it. Or I think Groton probably actually donated the island to the Mayhew Trust and keep it active. And so that was really neat. But I know the lodge that they had built in the 20s burned down at some point, I think in the 90s, and they rebuilt it. So I don't have much connection with that camp anymore, but I know they still do a wonderful job helping boys. We typically, and Pasquani typically, have one or two Mayhew boys every summer
So
that are on
that's still
scholarship.
that.
Yeah. I don't know if we had one last year, but I know the previous summer we did. And they're wonderful young men. Some of them, are stay right through graduation and become staff. And in fact, one young man that went to Mayhew that I bump into quite regularly is our UPS driver, Dickie Ray, who was one of my
I was
dad's.
just gonna say Dick Ray.
Yeah, yeah. So he was one of my dad's first campers in the 70s, and came from a pretty troubled family, and benefited from Mayhew, and then went to Mowgli as a camper. And now he has a large family, and he's making real good money as a UPS driver, and I see him all the time. But he was one of those success stories that came out of both camps.
Yeah, yeah.
And there used to be a Mowgli Pasquani Mayhew baseball game every year,
Right.
because we had a baseball diamond at Mayhew, and then Pasquani, it's a huge part of the camp there is baseball historically.
Mhm.
And I think for many years the Mayhew kids were undefeated because they they had all these really tough kids from either the inner city of Manchester or from Berlin. They were all big, strong kids and
Yeah.
had a little chip on their shoulder. And I remember hearing stories of like the Mowgli boys either taking the war canoes or sailing down to the island and spending the day playing baseball, having a meal, and then coming back up the lake. And
Yeah. Yeah.
those are the kind of things I'd love to see come back. One of the things I've talked about with both Nick and Mike over at Pasquani is having a Sunday barbecue with the two camps, and maybe we alternate seasons. And because I think there's a perceived rivalry, and really the camps are very, very similar. They're just a little bit older at Pasquani, and they focus a little bit more on less industries or activities because the boys are older. So, the trips are a little bit longer. They're a little bit more comprehensive. But I think our kids, do very, very similar and have similar successes that the kids at Pasquani have.
Sure. Sure.
And I'd love for those relationships to start build where, say a Cubite gets to meet a 17-year-old from Pasquani. I mean, that's like, those guys look like giants and vice versa. I think it's great for the Pasquani kids to see, hey, these are kind of the same kids we are. They're just smaller.
Yeah.
So,
Huh. Well, I I've always thought that I should one of the other podcasts that I do, as you know, is New Hampshire secrets, legends, and lore. And I always thought that I would like to do one about your dad because I think he was definitely a legendary person, and the founding of Mayhew. I've been friends with most of the people who were directors of Mayhew over the years.
Right.
They all talk about your dad with such affection.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. It's kind of neat because, I was very close with Mr. Gimjohn at Pasquani because of his relationship with my dad. And this is a bit of a sad note, but Bob Buckley, who was the watermaster at Pasquani for, I think, 45 years, just recently passed this past week. And his nickname affectionately was Bubbles. And Bubbles was a Yaley. There's a lot of Ivy League and Yale guys at Pasquani. And I always had a great relationship with him. But over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, he would always sort of corner me and just talk about my dad. And that was really neat. And one of his favorite stories was my dad was in Gemjohn's wedding party. And my dad, being a bit of a prankster, his closest friends, they would always crash each other's wedding night. That was sort of their tradition. And so there was always this elaborate network of operations going on to prevent that and also make it happen. And I think Gemjohn and his lovely bride ended up going somewhere up in the Poconos or something. And my dad and a couple of his buddies made the trip up there
Oh.
and knocked on the hotel door room. And Bubbles thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. So, but he was a tremendous man and a great loss for over there at Pasquani, and a guy who also, loved Mowgli and loved all the camps.
yeah, yeah. Well, we've lost in the last couple of years, we've lost some big folks at Mowgli too. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
Uh,
But it's great to see the legacy continue, So we lost Jonathan and Foyer, and now his son Ethan is really taking up the mantle. And then Charles, obviously, very involved, and is really going to steward, you know, um, some of the funds that family has given to our program. And I think Ethan is a guy that will probably likely be hopefully on the board of directors at some point.
yeah,
Again, a young, successful, engaged alum, and brings a lot of passion. He's been put on our archive committee, which I know you're a part of. So it's great to have the old wily veterans, and it's nice to mix in some new folks and some moms, and it's great to get a little bit different perspective from everybody.
yeah, yeah. Well, do you have any observations about, how you were affected by both Mowgli and Pasquani? Is there anything that sort of jumps out in your mind in terms of the differences between those experiences as well as the similarities?
I think the camps are way more similar than different. Obviously geographically, historically, there's a lot of crossover. My fondest memories, I think, of both places is I really thrived in the structure. I loved wearing a uniform. Um, my memory of you and guys like Jim Graff and Rich Morgan, guys that were counselors, Bob Bankston, when I was a camper, was you were all just these giants, giant men. And I loved the way that the uniform was so dialed in, the high socks, the wool. I know we all hated the wools and the flannels, but man, did they look sharp. And the uniforms evolved over the years to meet different needs. I think Pasquani is a little bit more rigid in their uniform. And part of that is, like they wear white muscle shirts with a big P on the front, which looks
Yeah.
great, but you really can't do that with a cubite, because by the end of the day, we tease our friend Arthur that you could tell what he had for lunch, dinner, and breakfast by his shirt. So the white would not probably hold very well in the Mowgli environment, which is great. That's a wonderful difference. I love the fact that there was a bit of a regimental system. dress right dress and doing colors is always a fond memory of mine. Um, I think the traditions are similar, but yet different at both places. There's a lot of crossover. There are other campers besides myself and Ned that did experience both camps. I think there's a little bit more crossover historically with Onaway and Pasquani. A lot of the staff, there was some crossover with staff, and we call it the Mowgli or the Pasquani Onaway brides and grooms, over the years, as families sort of went to both camps and had crossover. Brothers married, somebody else's sister and those kind of things. So that's really a neat connection. One of my fondest memories of Pasquani was every morning we would get up, put our robes on, walk down to the outdoor shower, which was basically a cement slab with some copper pipes. And there was a big trough to brush your teeth. And you had to get under a cold shower. And you had to spell out Pasquani twice vocally, because that meant you were probably under the shower for about 30 seconds, and then brush your teeth. And then you would go up and shake Mr. Gemjohn's hand and say, "Good morning, Mr. Gemjohn. I brushed my teeth," and give him a big smile. And I always thought it was a neat tradition. What I found out later was it's really a health check, right? The director is putting eyes on every camper every morning. And I think Nick does a very similar thing in a different way, in that he's constantly circulating around the dining hall and sitting at different tables. And he's always just trying to have his finger on the pulse of how the boys are doing. And you'll see him either walking or driving around on his little motor scooter and stopping and talking to kids and how you doing, what's new, where are you headed. And I've sort of tried to copy his lead a little bit, in the fact that when I was helping Tommy with maintenance, I had a little golf cart with my tools, and inherently I got to drive all over campus all day long, changing a light bulb, fixing a socket, whatever. And the best part of that was every 50 feet I would stop and, "Hey, Coach G," and I'd talk and, "Hey, what are you doing? Kids playing tetherball. Where you headed?" And then you also sort of get to see maybe where a kid shouldn't be, or maybe he's late to getting industry, and where are you supposed to be right now. So I think it's good to have eyes and ears all over the place, for the benefit of the campers, but also just to be able to interact with those kids. To me, is one of the best part of my days, just riding around campus, talking to kids. And I get to touch a lot of kids, through my conversations all throughout the day.
So the stuff that matters most about I'm going to say about the Mowgli experience, but what
Mm-hmm.
I intend to do is say that it's true of both Mowgli and Pasquani is the character building that
No
happens.
doubt. No doubt. I think the two things is, number one, being electronic free is so rare, but so vital. No computers, no cell phones. That's similar. I think Onaway does the same thing. Pasquani does the same thing. These kids have to unplug, because there's just so much positive that can come from technology, but a lot of negative. And, I see it in my athletes at Plymouth State, where it's a different world. When I was in college, you could do, something a little bit nutty and maybe have a few too many beers, and no one would know about it except the people in the room. Now it's everywhere. And so we talk to our guys at Plymouth, about, making really good decisions. And I talk a lot about my experiences at Mowgli and Pasquani to my athletes at Plymouth State. We actually brought the whole team over. Nick was very supportive of this, for an afternoon this past fall, for the guys to get exposed to our campus, but also just to come over and have some fun, jump in the lake. We did a little barbecue, and it was amazing to see 45, high level Division III athletes, student athletes, literally running around like a bunch of cubs, playing tetherball, go in the Gaga pit,
Yeah.
breaking up into small groups. Guys were playing wiffle ball. And the sort of benefit of that is, we now have some guys in the pipeline that I think will become staff at Mowgli, that
Oh,
are young men that have played for me. We had a couple this year that were very interested, and just logistically it didn't work out. But I think it's a natural fit to bring, you know, not only outdoor folks, we do have an outdoor education program at Plymouth where we've had counselors come from in the past. Um, but I just think that idea of instead of just going and working construction or working for your dad's law firm, go be in the outdoors for 9, 10 weeks while you're young, while you're a college age, guy or girl. So I think that's going to reap some benefits for us. Something that I learned at Pesquani was their mantra is stop and think. And it couldn't be simpler. It's something I put on wristbands and gave to all our team here at Plymouth. But very similar to Mowgli is this idea of character, making good decisions, being held accountable, being able to work with others. These are all things that help make athletic teams successful, but really any endeavor. And I just think it's so important that those traditions continue. And those relationships. I mean, the relationships I have with the guys that I've done just work weekends with at Pesquani are enduring. I have a whole new group of friends, guys that I didn't go to camp with. Some of them are 20 years younger than me, but through our shared experience, either at Mowgli or Pesquani, you develop these friendships that last throughout the year. So I think those are all vital things. I'll tell you a funny story about the stop and think. And the other part of it is, I talk about Mowgli all the time to my team. We had a young man that made a bad decision. We had given him these bracelets, Plymouth State Lacrosse, stop and think, and he was on a security guard's camera, and he had done a little bit of property damage in the dorm, nothing crazy, but just had a dumb moment. And he's on the security guards came down to our office, Mike's and I's office, and they're like, you got to see this footage. And he was very polite. He was apologetic. He paid his penalty, but he was like crying. And he's like, Coach G gave me this bracelet and I was supposed to stop and think, and I didn't stop and think. And now I'm going to get kicked off the team and I'm so sad. And so it did have an impact.
Sure.
And he goes, I forgot to stop and think. And so I love that experience. And our guys talk all the time about the day they spent over at Mowgli. And we're actually going to do it this year in the first week of school as a team builder and an icebreaker. Nick is actually going to come join us, I hope. And he's very good with a lot of these icebreaker sort of learning each other's names exercise that we do with our Mowgli staff. And we want to sort of mirror that with our team and sort of break down those barriers in the first week of school and also just expose them to that, hey, 15 minutes away, we have this jewel, maybe someday you could come back and be a counselor.
Nice. Bartolo Governanti, thank you so much for your time and for all that you do for Mowgli. And please, of course, extend those thanks to the entire staff at Mowgli. I mean, you
I
just
will.
an unbelievable group.
Yeah, we're really fortunate. Nick's got it dialed in. I think there's a lot of passion. There's certainly a lot of hard work. But we're all very fortunate. I tell my buddies that work on Wall Street all the time, they'll call me like, what are you doing? And I'll just take a picture sitting down at the waterfront. I'm like, I'm just sitting in my office, and they're just, oh, Governanti, you're such a jerk, whatever. But, they're making millions, but I'm much happier being up here in the woods.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
living millions.
Yeah. So I think we're really fortunate in that sense. And, to be able to work with, young men at camp and then, older men at the school, I sort of get the best of both worlds for sure.
Yeah. Well, good hunting, my friend.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Take care.